Okay, today's daf we're going to be learning is Pesachim daf Kuf Gimel. Today's daf is sponsored by Natanya Slamowitz in memory of her grandfather, her mother's father, Avram ben Chanoch Meir and Esther Dembinsky. He was a hero of the revisionist effort in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, murdered 20 Adar Bet 5703, March 27, 1943. Yehi Zichro Baruch. Okay, we're continuing in another interesting practical halacha type day with lots of interesting different opinions. So we're going to start with a topic that has 7 different opinions. Okay, and it's kind of funny the way they do it. We're going to see, as I mentioned yesterday, this yakne, yanha, himnak, kanya, all different what we call rashi tevot, which are abbreviations for what we do when, in which case. So we'll start right now at the bottom of Kuf Bet and Bet. Yom Tov shechal liot achal hashabbat. There's a 7-way debate, and maybe even 8, depending on what version you have, about whether when Yom Tov falls on Motzei Shabbat, okay, so just like we're going to have this year with Pesach, where the 14th of Pesach, Erev Pesach is going to be on Shabbat. So what do we do when it comes to Kiddush? We have to make Kiddush, and we also have to make Havdalah, and we also have to make a bracha on the candle, because the candle was we saw it was created on Motzei Shabbat. And we don't do bisamim though. Why don't we do the bisamim, the spices? Because the spices we're sad that Shabbat is leaving and we need this. They call it, on Shabbat, you have a neshama yetera. The sources say you have this extras. It's this idea that Shabbat is very special. And when Shabbat leaves, we're sad. So we need some bisamim, but you don't need that when you're going right into a Yom Tov. But you do need a Havdalah because the sanctity of Shabbat is greater than the sanctity of Yom Tov. Doesn't happen the reverse when Yom Tov goes into Shabbat. So now the question is, what's the order? So we have 4 blessings. We're going to add a 5th when we talk about Shechianu, but let's assume right now, because they're not discussing Shechianu. So we have the wine, we have Kiddush, we have Havdalah, and we have the candles. So what's the order that you do it in? And you're going to see that there's certain themes I'm going to explain to you. The Gemara doesn't really explain other than one thing they explain. Everything else, they kind of assume, I don't know, maybe you know, but the Rashbam goes into long definitions about, or descriptions about what's the logic behind each one. And we'll go through it, not inside in the Rashbam, but I'll give you the different concepts that explain each approach. So Rav Amal Yakne, he says, what's Yakne? Yain, wine, Kiddush, okay, Ner, and Havdalah. Okay, the candle and then Havdalah. Why? So the first 3, if you look at the chart on today's sheet, you can see the first 3 all have, this is why charts are very helpful, first 3 all have wine first. Okay, you could even, if you really want to go into it, you could try highlighting, because there's a few main issues. Number 1, where does wine go in the picture? Where does the candle go? Is Kiddush before Havdalah? Is Havdalah before Kiddush? So the first one all says wine comes first, the first 3 opinions. Why? Because there's this concept that we've seen many times, tadil v'she'ino tadil kodem. Something that's commonplace, that's done much more often, always goes first. We saw recently with the Korban Tamid. That's why it goes before the Korban Pesach in the afternoon of the 14th, because that's brought every day. And the Pesach is a once a year. So likewise, the wine we drink every day, right? In those days, particularly, they drank wine all the time. And here nowadays, it all depends on where you're from and what your custom is, whether you drink wine every day or not, or whether it's COVID or anything else. But wine is something much more common than Kiddush and Havdalah, so wine's going to go first. Then the issue is Kiddush or Havdalah. Once we have Kiddush comes before Havdalah, then obviously we'll do the candle before Havdalah, although I'll say obviously, not always, but we're going to assume right now you do the candle before Havdalah, because the Havdalah means, by the way, not the whole Havdalah service. Havdalah means the blessing, Hamavdil ben Kodesh L'chol, that we generally do at the end of our Havdalah service. What's nice about today is we're going to see why we do the order that we do in Havdalah. So when you get to Havdalah this week, you'll know, even though right now we're talking about a unique situation, soon we're going to get to what happens. And even though this is a unique situation, this is also going to happen in a few weeks when we get to Pesach, but also we'll learn why we do in a regular Havdalah, Bisamim, then Ner, and then Havdalah, right? The Yayin, we already know why we do it first because of Tadir V'Sheino Tadil. So we've already explained why the Borei Pri Hagafen is the first blessing of Havdalah. Now, Kiddush comes before Havdalah. So why would that be? 2 possible reasons. Either right now it's the Chag. So what's more important? It's more important to say Kiddush rather than say, well, we're finishing Shabbat. It's more important to say, hey, look, we're here, Kiddush, right? This is a sanctified day. Number 2, you don't want it to look like it's a burden, like, oh, I want to just get rid of Shabbat and now we can go into Yantif. So no, you'd rather bring in Yantif first and then say, oh, and by the way, we're distinguishing between Shabbat. So that's the logic. Again, we're going to bring the opposite logic for those who say that Havdalah comes before Kiddush. But right now we're explaining this approach. So that explains Yayin, Kiddush, Ner, then Havdalah, because again, Havdalah goes after Kiddush, and we'll put the Ner before because that's what we always do in general. Ushmuel Amar, Yanhak. Okay, what's Yanhak? Yayin, Ner, Havdalah, Kiddush. So the main difference here is that the Ner Havdalah element comes before Kiddush rather than after Kiddush. Why is that? This is the only one the Gemara is going to actually say inside, which is, okay, we can maybe even skip to it. In a few lines we're going to read, it's about 8 lines down in the next page, Amar Rabbi Chanina, Mashal Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya. Okay, he was talking about the last opinion there, but it doesn't matter. It's the same idea for ours, which is, here's a mashal. Lemelech sheyotze va'aparkos nichnas. It's like a king is leaving and an appointed, a governor type person is coming in. Now the king is obviously more important. So if the king is leaving, which is a reference to Shabbat, and the Sar is coming in, which is a reference, right? The officer is coming in, which is a reference to Yom Tov. So what do we do normally? You wouldn't have the officer or the governor or whoever he is come in when the king's still there. So first, Milavim et HaMelech, first you usher out the king, which is Shabbat, and then Achar kach yotzim likrat hafarkos, and then you bring in the new one. So it makes sense. Let's take out Shabbat, and then let's bring in Yom Tov. So that's the logic of Shmuel, which is the opposite. Rabba Amar Yahanek. Okay, so now we're going to start getting into more details. Okay, so he says you start off with Yayin, same thing. Havdalah comes before Kiddush, same thing as the previous. The one is Shmuel. Havdalah comes first. But what happens here? The Ner moves place, even though normally Ner comes before the Havdalah bracha. In this case, the Ner is going to split. We need something to split between Kiddush and Havdalah. Why is that? Because it almost sounds like a contradiction of sorts. You're saying it's not sanctified, it is sanctified. It's very weird, right? Havdalah is kind of saying we're separating between Kodesh and Chol. Now it's true we say a bit of a different Havdalah. We say between Kodesh and Kodesh, but still it almost sounds like we're taking away sanctity and then we're adding sanctity. Seems to contradict. So let's just split it up with putting a blessing in between. That's his opinion. Levi Amar Kanya. Okay, so now what's this? Now if you can already look at the chart, you see all the rest of them don't have Yayin in the beginning. And that's because even though we have this concept of Tadir v'Sheino Tadir, sometimes there's other issues at play. And even though we have this concept, it doesn't apply here. So why not? So let's talk about it. So we're going to start with Kiddush before Havdalah. That's our number one issue. Which comes first? Kiddush comes before Havdalah. Now, what's moved here though that's different? The Ner is no longer next to Havdalah, and we have the wine right before the Havdalah bracha. Now, why is that? So for this, you have to know something we're going to talk about in a few days, which is that Kiddush, theoretically, you don't have to make on wine. You can make it on bread if you want. Okay, we'll talk about that in a few days. It doesn't have to be made on wine, but Havdalah can only be made on wine. Now, I know you're going to tell me, wait a minute, isn't Havdalah more lenient? Havdalah you can make theoretically, maybe even some people say on milk or on Coke or on, there's a whole debate about all these things. Can you make it on some other kind of drink? But even if you say you can make it on some other kind of drink, which we'll get to that whole sugya, very interesting sugya in a few days, even if you say that, you still have to make it on a drink. It can't be made on bread, whereas Kiddush doesn't necessarily need wine or a drink. And therefore, they specifically want to make sure you know that the wine is going on your Havdalah, because your Havdalah won't work if you don't have it on wine. So they don't like that the wine, if Kiddush comes first, then you can do wine, Kiddush, Ner, Havdalah. There's a big break between the wine and the Havdalah. And we want to make sure that it's clear that the wine is going on the Havdalah. So therefore, the wine gets moved to the end, and where to move it as close to Havdalah as possible. And that's why we end up with a split between the candle and the Havdalah. The Rabbanan Amre, okay, the rabbis say, okay, so we have Rav, Shmuel, Rabba, Levi. We're now up to option number 5. Kina. Okay, Kina starts with Kiddush, Yayin, Ner, Havdalah. It's really the same as the previous, but it's saying this way, the Ner Havdalah element, we don't want to split between those two. So as long as we put the wine in between, and then also we benefit here because then the wine is next to Kiddush and it's also next to Havdalah. It's true, we have the candle in between, but the candle is part and parcel of Havdalah. So it's better to do it this way, according to the rabbis. That way the wine is next to Kiddush and also next to Havdalah, and the Havdalah element is just these two together, the Ner and the Havdalah, so it's okay. Mar Berei de Ravna Amar Nikiha. Okay, what's the logic here? We start with the candle. Okay, now Okay, let's start with the end. Again, we want the wine to be right in between Kiddush and Havdalah. So now, why does the candle move to the front? That's very strange, especially if it comes right before Kiddush. It seems like a very odd order. But there's another thing at play here, and what's that? The ner, and we're going to see this soon also, that we want the ner to be the first thing we make a bracha on. Why is that? Because you light the candle. Now, what's the bracha? You're benefiting from using the candle. It's another reason why we say it on Motzei Shabbat. Besides that, the fire was created on Motzei Shabbat. Also, now we're showing we can now use light that we couldn't before, right? We can use a candle. Now, which you can use on Yom Tov. You just can't light it from scratch, but you could use it if it was, right? You can light from an already lit candle. So now what's the idea? The idea is once you lit that candle, we want to make the blessing on it as soon as possible because you've already benefited from it. And therefore, or we'll see, maybe there's another reason I'm going to get to in a few minutes, but the ner should really be first. And therefore, the ner comes first, and then we have the wine right in between Kiddush and Havdalah. And it's also better that the wine, right, that Kiddush and Havdalah surround the wine. That way it's very clear, even though I said before, again, you could argue every art, you could convince anyone of any argument. Before we said, well, ner and Havdalah go together, so it's really next to Havdalah, but this is really next to Havdalah if you put it right up against it, and then the ner jumps to the front because better to do the ner first. Maybe I'll already tell you the other reason. The other reason to do the candle first is, I'll read you from, I just wanted to read it inside. This is all based on this Mishnah where there's a machloka bet Shammai bet Hillel that we're going to see soon about regular Havdalah and whether candle comes before B'samim or B'samim comes before the candle. And the reason to say that the ner comes first, the candle comes first, one of the reasons the Melechet Shlomo brings in his commentary on the Mishnah is, he says, ner kodem hakol. Why? Mipnei shahayu aniyim, they were poor. Birov halelot hayu below ner. Most nights they didn't have candles at night for the most part. That's why people, we've talked about this in the beginning of bracha, they would come home and eat right away, the poor people, because their candle would burn out. And also they didn't have fire to cook their food, so their food was made pretty quickly. Now what happened? They would light a candle on Shabbat to last all Shabbat. But by this point, it's going to flicker and almost go out. We're almost done with, think about those Yurtzeit candles, right? When you try to relight them at the end of the first day of the holiday, and there's almost nothing there, right? So there was a concern that if I start saying the bracha of Havdalah, my candle might burn out. So that's another reason to say the candle first. So either because we're worried that you've already said it and we don't want you to benefit from it until you've made the bracha, but also we're worried that the candle might actually burn out. Okay, so that's another reason. So now he says, so that's how we get to Nikiya. So again, Yain splits between Havdalah and Kiddush so that we know it goes for both. And the ner goes to the beginning. Marta Amar Mishmei Rav Yoshua. Now it says Nihak, but most Girsa'ot change it to Nahik. And now we're on our last opinion. If you say Nihak, then we're actually going to have 8 opinions, but we're going to do it as Nahik, which seems most people explain that way. And then the next source is going to basically be a proof of this last approach, which means there's only 7. Nahik. Okay, so in this case, we still do the ner in the beginning, as we said, but Havdalah comes before Kiddush. So it's the same logic as the last time. It's just which comes first. Again, we saw already the logic of why Havdalah should come before Kiddush, why Kiddush should come before Havdalah. So this is a great mathematical equation, right? If 4 brachot, how many permutations can you possibly have, right? So we got to 7. Obviously, mathematically, you could get to a lot more, but the Gemara wasn't doing mathematics. They were doing what logically makes sense. And with the different arguments side, they got to 7 different permutations of these 4 blessings. Okay, next. So now we're going to have a support for this last one. Again, if I read it according to the Girsa that most people correct it to. Marta Amar Mishmei Rav Yoshua Nihak. Okay, he also said in the name of Rav Yoshua Nihak. That was what we just read. My mistake. That was what we just read. Now, Shalach le'avua de Shmuel leRebbi. So now we're going to have a story that proves this. The father of Shmuel sent to Rebbe a question. Yelamdenu Rabbeinu seder havdalot he'ach. You could see why he asked this because it was a lot of confusion about what to do. I mean, a lot of these opinions came after Rebbe, but still the point is in his time also, he didn't know what to do. Shalach le said to him back, also remember, this doesn't happen very often. So it's one of those classic examples where you get to it and you say, oh, what are we supposed to do, right? You definitely need a machzer or a sitter to tell you, what exactly, like there's these Seder HaKadushot, if you've ever seen like a bencher with all the different kiddushes in it, right? So this would be a good example of when you need that. So how do we do it? Shalach le, kach amar Rabbi Yishmael bar Rabbi Yossi, shamar mishum aviv, shamar mishum Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya. We have a tradition of a tradition of a tradition. Nahik, okay? And this supports, again, the reading of Marta, Mishmei de Rabbi Yeshua, that it's Nahik, that, again, near first, Havdalah, Yain, Kiddush, which is interesting because that's not what we do. Amar Rabbi Chanina, Mashal de Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya, Lemelech. Now, this is what we read already. So the reason he puts Havdalah, he's only talking about the element of Havdalah before Kiddush, is this mashal that we read already. I'll just read it again. Melech sheyotzeh v'afarkos nichnas. The king leaves and the officer comes in. Milavin et hamelech v'acharkach yotzim l'kat aparkos. So you usher him out and then you bring in the new officer. My have'ala. So now, okay, we've had this great sugya with 7 different opinions. What are we supposed to do? So Amar Abai Amal yakzina. Now all of a sudden, Abai and Rava have a machloket. They enter into the equation Berchat Shechianu, which wasn't even mentioned before. It's kind of funny because we're asking, what do we do about that? And when they get to the halacha, they point out, well, by the way, there's also the Shechianu bracha. So Abaye says yakzina. Okay, what's yakzina? So zman. So first of all, he yells yakne, like the very first opinion we saw, which was Rav. Again, let's just review. Yayim first, tadir v'sheno tadir kodem. The typical, the regular one goes first. Kiddush comes before Havdalah because it's more important, or because we don't want to quickly get rid of our Shabbat, and the Ner goes before Havdalah, as it usually does. So now, he says you put Zman in the middle, which makes actually the most sense, even though this isn't what we do. Why does Zman go in the middle? Because you do Zman right after Kiddush. Kiddush is saying today is sanctified. Zman is saying today is a sanctified day. It's a little bit strange to put it at the end after Havdalah. So that's what he says. But Rava Amal, Yaknehaz, which is very famous. You probably heard this. If not, now it's your first time, you should remember this because everybody talks about Yaknehaz. Okay, this is Yaknehaz. This is where it comes from, which means we put Shechianu at the end. Why do we put Shechianu at the end? Because all these, as we said before, so Kiddush, it's true, it doesn't exactly need wine, but it needs something. It needs bread or something to go with it. You don't just make Kiddush without some kind of object, some kind of food. Havdalah, we already said, needs the wine, but Brachat Shechianu, theoretically, you could say without. When do we see that? On Yom Kippur. When we can't drink wine, we do say Brachat Shechianu, right? We don't make Kiddush on Yom Kippur night, but we do say Shechianu. So Shechianu doesn't need wine at all. And that's why it's the very last thing we say, because theoretically, you could just say it independently. And in fact, right, women generally say it when they light candles. They don't say it with a cup. So therefore, they say Yaknehaz, and in fact, Hilchata Kerava. We paskin like Rava. Okay, that was our interesting sugya about the order. We have one last thing to discuss about the order before we move on to another topic, which eventually will connect back. Rav Huna bar Yehuda Ikla Lebei Rava. Okay, we're going to have a lot of situations today because, as I said, like yesterday, this is something that went on all the time, and people went to other people's houses and saw what they did and started asking and why and how and what. So what happened? Rav Huna comes to Rava's house. We're going to see a lot of stories with Rava today. So they bring him for Havdalah. This is regular Havdalah now. We're not talking about a holiday. They bring a candle and spices. Barich Rava abesamim bereisha v'hadar amaor. First he made a blessing on the spices. Then he made a blessing on the light, on the candle. Amar le. So he says, Rav Huna bar Yehuda says to Rava, V'ha ben Shammai uben beit Hillel ma'or bereisha v'hadar abesamim. But we learned in Masechet Brachot, okay, which we're going to see soon, that both of them think that the candle comes first and the besamim second. Now you might be thinking, what are you talking about? At our Havdalah, what do we do? First, right, again, we start with the wine, then we do the besamim, the spices, then we do borei merei ha'esh on the fire, and then we do Havdalah. So it seems weird that Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel both say the candle comes first, but we'll get to this. So, and we do what Rava did, right, which is the besamim come first. So he says to him, but I don't understand. Both Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel hold the candle comes first. Umaihi, where do we see this? Ditnan, it says in the following mission in Masechet Brachot. Beit Shammai ombrim ner umazon ubesamim b'avdalah. Now they're talking here. Notice what's missing. Wine is missing. It doesn't say when you make the wine. I assume that when you do the Birkat Hamazon, then you do the wine, although it's not so clear. But ner mazon besamim b'avdalah. The important part here is that the candle comes. This is a case where you're making Havdalah and you're also saying Birkat Hamazon at the same time and you're using the same cup. Remember, we saw some people said you can't use the same cup. Some people said you could use the same cup. But the important part for our purposes is that the ner comes before the besamim. And then Beit Hillel omrim neru b'samim mazon v'havdalah. Now I'll just make this in a very simple way, and I'll say it in a much simpler way than they say it because it's a little hard to follow all the things. But they both say that the candle comes first, and they both say havdalah is the last bracha. The difference between them, and I put this on the chart, you can see it very easily, is the mazon and b'samim. Does Birkat Hamazon come first, or do the b'samim come first? That's the debate between them. But clearly the candle comes first. So how is it that you made a bracha on the b'samim first? Ani Rava Batre v'amar, so divrei Rabbi Meir. Aval Rabbi Yehuda Omer, lo nechleku beit Shammai u'beit Hillel al hamazon shu b'tchila v'al havdalah shi basof. Comes, he says, listen. Okay, and this happens very often, by the way. Beit Shammai, Beit Hillel have a machloket, but they were from earlier generations. Later generation Tanaim have a debate about what their debate was. So this version of our Mishnah, the Mishnah that we see, is Rabbi Meir's version of the machloket, who thinks that ner always comes first, according to both. But Rabbi Yehuda has a different opinion. He says that's not what their argument wasn't about food, Birkat Hamazon, versus Bisamim, and which comes first in the middle of two brachot. No, Alma nechleku ala ma'or v'ala Bisamim. And I forgot to explain. He says, Lo nechleku beit Shammai u'beit Hillel al hamazon shu b'tchila al havdalah shu basof. You clearly do Birkat Hamazon first. Why is that first? Because you just ate and you have to finish your meal. So Birkat Hamazon clearly comes first. Then presumably the wine, which makes sense then, because tadir v'sheino tadir, right? You don't make the wine before the Birkat Hamazon. You Birkat Hamazon and make the bracha on the wine. Then, and everyone agrees the Havdalah bracha comes at the end. The debate is the two in between. Where do you do the candle and the Bisamim? And that's the machloket. Let's see. Alma nechleku ala ma'or v'ala Bisamim. That's their debate. Beit Shammai omrim ma'or v'achar kach Bisamim. The candle comes first and then the Bisamim. And that's for the reasons I said before, which is either they're poor and they're worried their candle's going to burn out, or you see the candle and you immediately benefit from it, whereas the Bisamim, unless you put it close to your nose, you're not going to benefit from it until you do that. So the candle you already see. So therefore the candle, especially in those days when it was dark, right? Even we close the lights generally, right? It's definitely a custom. Because the lights, you already see the candle, you should make a bracha on that first, right? Which now makes a lot of sense. So you're going to wonder why did the Bisamim come first. Ubeit Hillel omrim Bisamim v'achar kach ma'or. So there's your answer. We hold like Beit Hillel according to Rabbi Yehuda's interpretation. The Bisamim come first. Rabbi Yochanan, and by the way, they say that Rabbi Yochanan said, Nahagua am ki Beit Hillel v'aliba de Rabbi Yehuda. Also, besides that Rava held this way, also Rabbi Yochanan held this way, that we hold like Beit Hillel according to Rabbi Yehuda's understanding. The Bisamim come first. Now, why the Bisamim come first? So here I also wanted to read to you from the Mishnah. So the Tosfot Yom Tov there explains that Mivi'im, what's the issue? So he says about the ner for Beit Shammai, you bring the ner and that's why you benefit immediately. And then the mazon comes next because you already ate. Okay, that's according to the first reading, that it's ner. He was explaining Beit Shammai, ner and then mazon. Ner is first because you see it, so you got to deal with it right away. And then the mazon comes next because you already ate and you got to deal with that. Okay, and then Beit Hillel say no. The Bisamim have to go near the candle. Now this is explaining the first reading of Rabbi Meir. No. The ner, yes, comes first, but the Bisamim go together with the candle. It seems weird to split between the two of those things. That's his reason for that. And then he says, but what about the Bisamim first? So which is what we do. So he says, because the Bisamim come for this nefesh yetera that you get on Shabbat. So if you have this nefesh yetera, this extra soul that now leaves you, and therefore you want to do that first, Lashiv nishmato. In other words, Shabbat is leaving. You want to make sure first to smell the Bisamim and calm you down from the fact that Shabbat is leaving. And then you move on to things like the ner, which has to do with, now we can light candles, or we're remembering Motzei Shabbat. But it makes sense to do the Bisamim first, because that also has to do with Shabbat, and that's what's ending right now. So the Bisamim actually come first. So now when you do Havdalah, again, this is a good classic example of something we do all the time, and we just never really think about, right? Why do we do this order, and why is it like that, right? You have 4 blessings, and why are they organized in that structure? So now you know. And as I said, it'll help you for when we get to Kiddush on Seder night, and you'll see the order, and you'll say, oh, I know why the order is that way. Okay, next. So that was our first story. Now we have another story. And remember this story because we're going to have a few stories in between, and we're going to come back to this story. Okay, there was apparently one weekend, it was a big weekend, when Rav Yaakov bar Abba Ikla Lebei Rava. He came to Rava's house, and we're going to see that he was an interesting guest. So we'll see why in a minute. So he sits down Friday night dinner, and he sees he makes a borei pri hagafen in the beginning of the meal. And then when it comes time for Birkat Hamazon, he also says borei pri hagafen At the end, he benches and says Borei Pri Hagafen on the wine. This is exactly what we do, right? When we do, if people are careful to also, right? Some people do make Borei Pri Hagafen every time they bench. Many people don't, but if you're at a Sheva Brachot or a bris or something like that, then they do. And you always make a new Borei Pri Hagafen, which seems weird because you've just benched. You're almost benching is saying we're done eating, but then you know you're going to eat after. Theoretically, in theory, you could have had in mind, you knew you were going to eat, drink the wine. So don't you say that your first Borei Pri Hagafen would cover the blessing after benching. So that's really his question. He says, I don't understand. You already benched in the beginning of the meal. You knew you were going to have this wine at the end of the meal, even though you benched in the middle, but still, why are you making another blessing? Especially if, blessings you don't just make for no reason. So he says, right, so lama lach kulei hai, why are you doing this? Habarich lamar chadazina, you already made a bracha. Amar lei, so he says to him, listen, his first answer is an interesting answer. He says, ki avina be reish galuta, hachi avdinan. When I was in the reish galuta's house, that's what they did. That's why I do it. Very strange answer for someone like Rava, who's a Talmid Chacham in his own right. He says, because I saw the Reish Galuta doing it. Why is it strange? Well, first of all, we've seen in the Reish Galuta's house all sorts of things that go on there that were not necessarily purely halachic things going on. So it's not the best example of a place where I would say, I want to learn my halacha from there. So it seems strange, he says this, and in light of the continuation, it seems particularly strange. So what happens? He says to him, Amar lei, tinach be Reish Galuta, tahachi avet. I understand why in the Reish Galuta's house they do it that way. Why? The Safek Maitelan, Safek Lo Maitelan. Now he's not going to say, I don't trust the Reish Galuta, but Rav Yaakov Bar Abba is going to say the situation is different in the Reish Galuta's house. There it makes sense that they made a new Borei Pri Hagafen, but here it doesn't. Why is that? When you're a guest in someone's house, especially in the Reish Galuta's house, you don't know what's coming your way. You have no idea what's going to be. So when you make your first bracha, you bring wine in front of you, you see wine, you make a bracha on the wine. But you don't know that they're going to bring you a cup of wine for Birkat Hamazon. So why are you, there it makes sense that now this all has to do with what we said yesterday. A lot of it has to do with what's in your head, because what we call is hesech hadat. Hesech hadat means you intended to stop eating and then you need to make a new bracha if you had hesech hadat. But here, so the assumption is you got this one cup of wine. You assume that's what they're giving you, right? You don't know how much more is coming. So you had in mind that cup of wine. You didn't think that they were going to bring you wine after the meal for Birkat Hamazon. Now you might say, well, what do you mean? Kosher bracha, you always say Birkat Hamazon. And we saw that yesterday. It's a debate. Does everyone have a kosher bracha or is it just the person doing the zimut? So you didn't know you were going to drink wine. So therefore, you didn't think about it. So therefore, your bracha in the beginning doesn't cover it. But but here we're sitting here. The cup has been on the table the whole time. We knew we were going to have a cup for Birkat Hamazon. This is your house. You knew, even if it wasn't on the table, right? Your dot was on it. Your mind was on the fact that you knew that was happening. So when you made your first bracha, you knew it was going to cover the wine also at the end. So your bracha should cover it. So what does he say? So Amar lei. So now, remember, what did he answer in first? A very strange answer. Oh, it's because they did it in the Reish Galuta's house. But now that he pushes him on it, he says, fine, I'll give you a better reason, which is strange why he didn't give him this reason in the beginning. In the first place, and we're going to see the same structure in a later story between the two of them today. So he says, Amar lei. Ana avde ketalmidei de Rav. Oh, well, you're asking me more. Fine, I'll tell you the real answer. I hold like Rav's students. Okay, how so? We're now going to see a story about them. And from there, we're going to get to another story. And then we'll get back to this situation where Rav Yaakov Bar Abba was in Rav's house. So now he says, what's the story of the Talmidei de Rav? De Rav Brona, de Rav Hananel, Talmidei de Rav, Havuyat Besudata. These two students of Rav were sitting at a meal. And what happened? Kai alayu Rav Yeva Saba. He was the butler at the meal. He was serving the food. Amarle, they said to him, Havlan Amrule. They said to him, Havlan v'nivrach. Bring us wine so we can make Birkat Hamazon, so we can say the blessing after the meals. L'sof Amrule, but then they said, Havlan v'nishte. You know what? We changed our mind. We want to keep going on with our meal. We want more wine in our meal. Amar lehu hachi amarav. He said to them, Rav Yeva said, listen. Okay, it's interesting, right? The person serving the food knows more better than them. He says to him, listen, hachi amarav. Rav said the following, kevan de amaritu havlanu nevarech istira lechu lemishte. Now that you said we're going to bench, just saying we're going to bench means you're forbidden to eat anything or drink any more wine. Now, what does it mean you're forbidden? So there's two different approaches to this. One approach is to say you have to bench. You have no choice. You can't eat, drink, anything. You must bench right now. Another is to say that no, you had Haseh Hadat. What does that affect? Haseh Hadat again means my mind wandered off of it, right? I made a blessing. That covers everything I'm going to eat in this meal. But now I intended to end the meal. So I stopped, right? Whatever I did before is finished. Now, if I want to continue drinking, I have to make a new blessing. So you'd have to say, Borei Peri Agafin, you could continue eating, but it's forbidden to eat until you make a new blessing. So if I want to drink another cup of wine, I say Borei Peri Agafin, and then I continue, and then I can bench later. So there's a debate about this. But in any case, the point is, right, and then it says my time, or what's the reason? Das chitu da'ataychu. You already had Haseh Hadat, where you already broke your thinking, your train of, right, your connection between the first blessing and now. So the idea here is that benching, or the not even benching itself, but just saying I want to bench already disconnects you with the previous blessing. Therefore, and this would obviously be even if you didn't say I want to bench, but obviously you benched, that all the more so. So as soon as you bench, that cuts you off from your original blessing. That means I'm finished. And now you start again. So if you're going to make a blessing on Birkat Hamazon, if you're going to make Birkat Hamazon on a cup of wine, you're going to say you're going to drink a cup of wine at the end of benching, then you would have to make a Borei Peri Agafin from the beginning, a new one. So that explains Rava's custom. That he explains now to Rav Yaakov. So again, it's a little bit strange, the structure. First, Rav Yaakov questions him, what are you doing? Rava answers, because the Reish Galuta did it that way. He says, no. The Reish Galuta is different because you didn't know more wine was coming. If you had known the wine was coming, like in your house, then theoretically your first bracha should have covered. And he says, no. Benching, or even the thought to bench, already cuts you off from your first blessing. You need a new one. Now, because we're on this story, this situation of how many blessings do you make? Do you make a blessing on the cup of wine at the end of the meal, which we just said you do? We're going to bring another story. This story was the students of Rav, presumably second generation Amoraim. Now we're jumping to the end of the time of the Amoraim, the people living in the time of the Gemara, because we have Rav Ashi here and Amemar and Mar Zutra, all the last generation. Amemar, Umar Zutra, Rav Ashi, Havu Yatve Besuda. They were eating at a meal. V'kai alayu Rav Acha Bereid Rava. Rav Acha Bereid Rava was serving them. Again, we're going to have the same situation where, in this case, though, the Shamash, instead of telling them the halacha, he's going to kind of question them. And this is a classic example of when you act in a certain way, but there's more behind the scenes that people don't know, it becomes confusing. And how are you supposed to learn halacha? Can you just assume if you see somebody doing something that you understand everything about what they're doing and can assume and say, this is the halacha? Or maybe you're missing some of the details and maybe it's better to ask and discuss because maybe you don't understand the whole picture. So let's see. So they were eating at a meal. We're going to have 3 rabbis, 3 different things go on. Okay. This is classic, right? You have one community, right? One shul, and then, they break out into a million different shuls, right? There's always differences of opinion. So let's see. They were eating at a meal. So he's the shamash. Amemar baruch al kol kasa v'kasa. They drank a lot of wine in the meal, and Amemar makes a separate blessing on every single cup of wine. Umar Zutra baruch hakasa kama v'akasa batra. Mar Zutra did exactly what Rava did. He did the first blessing on the wine, and then he benched at the end of the meal on wine and made a Borei Peri Agafin. Then Rav Ashi baruch hakasa kama v'tulo baruch. Rav Ashi makes a bracha on the first cup and doesn't make any more brachot. Okay, so we have one person who makes a bracha on every cup, one person who makes a bracha on the first and the last, and one person who only makes a bracha on the first. So what's the reaction of Rav Acha? Barava, Amar Lehu Rav Acha Barava, Anan Kiman Navid. Now you've totally confused me. What am I supposed to do? If I look at what's going on here, I see 3 different things going on. It's super confusing. So everyone now is going to explain the logic behind what they did. And you'll see that they don't all necessarily disagree. Amemar Amar Nimlach Ana. He says, listen, I change my mind all the time. I thought when I made the bracha that I was going to drink just 1 cup. Right? Maybe he was an alcoholic and said, I'm going to limit myself to 1 cup of wine. So I figured I was only drinking 1 cup. Then, okay, we were eating, there was more wine. I decided, let me have another cup. But every time I had another cup, I said, this is going to be my last cup. And then, right, for me, it's not exactly alcoholic, but it's more like with cookies, right? You start eating a cookie, you take a snack, and then you're done. You say, okay, I'm just taking 1 cookie. That's it. 5 minutes later, you come into the kitchen, you go look for the second cookie, right? Now, do you have to make another bracha on that? Because according to this, which is halal, right? This is it. This is what you call Haseh Hadat. I said, now one could argue, how much did I really think I was only going to eat one cookie, right? And that's where it really goes, this debate, which is, what was I really thinking? Did I think I'm really only eating one cookie, or did I think I'm going to eat one cookie and then I'll see, right? And then you went again, oh, I'm going to eat one more cookie and then I'll see. So if it's like that, then you don't have to make a new blessing. But if you really said, this is it, I'm not eating another cookie, and then you change your mind 5 minutes later, you'd have to make a new bracha. So it's the same thing here. He kept saying, I'm not drinking any more wine, and then changed his mind. So now, what happens? So his opinion is not a different opinion. It's just that and this is why I said you have to be careful when you watch people. You don't know what's going on in his mind. You don't know what he was thinking about his wine. So once he explained it, it makes perfect sense. Marzutra says, I was holding like the students of Rav, who said benching splits it, right? Benching is your separation. Now you need to make a new bracha. Rav Ashi thought, we don't hold like the students of Rav. And therefore, and how does he know this? Because he doesn't view benching as a break. Why not? And here he brings an interesting kind of proof, which is not a great proof. We'll see. So if you're not convinced by it, don't worry. Neither is the Gemara. So they try to explain why. And now we get to why this sugya was brought up here, because what was the connection of benching and making brachas on wine connected to yaknaha and yaknahas and all that? So he says, Yom Tov that happens after Shabbat, or where we started today, Amar Rav Yakne. Now, what does Yakne mean? You do Yayin, Kiddush, Ner Havdalah. Now, according to this, what happens? Remember, there were those who wanted to put the wine next to the Havdalah, in between the Kiddush and Havdalah? That makes more sense, he says. But here you have wine, you have Kiddush, you have the Ner, and then you have Havdalah. The wine seems to go with the Kiddush. And then you have Havdalah, which separates, kind of just like benching makes a separation. Also, Havdalah makes this separation. It's actually funny because Havdalah means to separate, but that's not why. But the idea here is you have this additional blessing, which theoretically already makes a break between your bracha on the wine and your drinking. So theoretically, you should have to make another borei preagafen here because the Havdalah bracha separates. Now, you might say Birkat Hamazon is different, and it's true, and we're going to get to that. So that's why I said this isn't the most convincing argument. So he says, there, Havdalah doesn't separate. You can still drink your wine without actually making an additional borei preagafen. Likewise, benching doesn't split between your kiddush or whatever, even if it wasn't a Shabbos meal, between your borei preagafen in the beginning of the meal and the end. So that's why he thinks you don't need another bracha. So really, even though there were 3 different opinions, there really weren't 3 different opinions. It's 2 opinions. Do we hold you need the benching splits and you need to start again, or no? So now the Gemara says belohi, but Rav Ashi's answer isn't a good answer. Why? Because hatam, benching is clearly different from Havdalah, because when you decided to bench, what'd you do? Akar da'atemi mishtia. You basically decide, I'm stopping to drink. So that's why you need a new blessing, not because there's some other bracha in between, like a random one like Havdalah. No, Havdalah doesn't work the same way as Birkat Hamazon in this way, which is what you probably would have said. And therefore, hachalo akar da'atemi mishtia. But when it comes to Havdalah, you're not saying, I don't plan to drink anymore. And that's why you can still drink your wine, even though you made your blessing on the wine before. Also, by the way, there's another big difference, which is this is all in one saying, right? There, you ate in the middle, then you decided to bench, and then, right? It's different entirely. So therefore, they seem to be rejecting Rav Ashi's reasoning. Okay. Now, this was all to explain the first part of what happened when Rav Yaakov Bar Abba gets to Rav's house, and he sees him benching, and he doesn't understand why he makes a borei preagafen, to which Rav explains why he makes a new bracha borei preagafen. Now Shabbat continued, and Shabbat was over. In this nice Shabbat that Rav Acha Bar Yaakov spent at Rava's, or I don't know if it was so nice, because you'll see that I don't know if Rava was so happy that he invited him, because he keeps asking him nuniki questions. So Kimat Avdullah, and I say they're nuniki because you could see by Rava's reactions. I think the fact that Rava reacted originally and said, oh, because that's what they do with the Reish Galuti, he was just trying to push him off. When he saw that he wasn't willing to be pushed off, he then answers him a better answer, because we're going to see the exact same structure in the second question. So when he gets to Havdalah, Kam Shame va'adlik avukam mishchaga. So now the shamash gets up, the servant there, and he lights a torch, not just a candle, but he takes a candle and he lights from it a bigger candle. Amarle, lama lach kulei, same question, right? What are you doing this for? And so he seems to be, I wouldn't say nuniki questions, but it's kind of not very respectful, right? He's in someone's house and they're doing something he doesn't understand. He says, what are you doing this for? Right? There's a nicer way to ask. So things like he's not asking so nicely. So he says, Haman chashraga, you already have a candle. Why are you lighting a bigger torch from the candle? You could just use the candle. Amar le. So again, he answers him a very strange answer. Shame midate denafshe kavid. The servant's doing it on his own. I didn't ask him to do it. Why are you question? It's almost like, why are you asking me this question? I didn't do it. The servant did it. Don't ask me. So from Yaakov bar Abba does not like this answer. He says, Amar le, I lo shmiya le mine demal lo hava avid. Your servant doesn't act without asking you. If you hadn't told him to do this, there's no way he would have done that on his own. He only does things because you tell him. So now he really answers him the appropriate answer. Again, this is why you have to assume that Rava was just annoyed by his questions and was answering him with these, trying to just push him off. But when he sees he can't get there, and that obviously frustrates Rav Yaakov bar Abba, who's smarter and understands that he's just getting pushed off and he's not willing to let go. So Amarle, lo savarle mar avukala avdala mitzvah min hamuvchal. Don't you know that? And so now Rava answers him. He says, why are you asking me this question? Don't you know that it's a better mitzvah to light the candle using a torch? And this is why we light a candle, right? We have special Havdalah candles that have more than one wick for this reason. Why is it mitzvah min hamuvchal? So many explain, I don't think it explains it fully, but there's the bracha is borei me'orei ha'esh, different types of flames. And in a torch, you'll see different shades of flame, of fire, and therefore it's more of a you get more benefit from it maybe, but it also fulfills the wording of the bracha. It doesn't really explain why the bracha isn't me'or. We actually learned that sugya already. Is it ma'or? Is it ma'orei? And they held it was ma'orei, and from there we got to the avukah. So now, next thing happens. There's one more question that we're going to see for right now, which is then what happens? So he takes out the avukah. Now we're up to the next part. Now he's going to say Havdalah. So now this teaches you about tefillot in those times. Okay, tefillot in those times were not the way prayers are nowadays, where it's very set and we open a book and we know exactly what to say. But then, and I talked about this in the skills class, for those who are in the skills class, when we talked about the development of the Haggadah, and we'll talk about it more as we get to it, which is there were texts, there were guidelines. These are guidelines for how you're supposed to do it, but you can make your own words. You can do it as long as you fit in within those guidelines. So here's a good example of that. Patach va'amar. So now he says his bracha of Havdalah. What is the blessing for Havdalah? This sounds very much like our blessing, right? So it's God who separates between sanctity and nonsense, non-sanctity, Bein or lechoshech, light and darkness, Bein Yisrael la'amim, the Jews and other nations, Bein Yom HaShvi'i l'sheshei me'amaseh, between the seventh day and all the other days. Amarle, lama lach kulei hai. Why do you have such a long bracha, right? If you ever think about it, that was a very long bracha. You could have just said, Hamavdil ben kodesh l'chol, right? Very simple. That's what it's really all about. Or ben sheshe ben yom hashvi l'sheshe me'amaseh. Where do we get to? Light and darkness and Yisrael and the other nations. What does that have to do with anything here? So Ha'amal of Yehuda Amarav, and he says to him even more so, he starts quoting him sources. He says, Hamavdil ben kodesh l'chol, zohi avdalato shel Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. If it was good enough for Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, why is it not good enough for you? All you really have to say is, Hamavdil ben kodesh l'chol. So why do you have this long Megillah? Amar le. Now this time he actually answers him. Okay, maybe he realizes he can't get away with these short answers that are just going to push him off. He realizes he has to answer him properly, and he says, Ana kehasfirale. This is what I hold by. To Amar Rabbi Elazar, Amar Rabbi Yoshaya. Rabbi Elazar passed down the name of Rabbi Yoshaya. There are Moraim from Eretz Yisrael. Hapochet lo yivchot mishlosha, v'mosif lo yosif al shiva. This is where I said you have guidelines. The guidelines are, according to Rabbi Yoshaya, if you're going to do less, don't do less than 3. If you're going to do more, don't do more than 7. In other words, your range is 3 to 7 of how many havdalot you're going to say, which seems clear that in those times, the idea was say some sort of nusach of separation between things, add whatever you want, right? But don't do less than 3, don't do more than 7. Okay, the example I brought in the skills class, which is really similar to this one, and we talked about it, is this machloket Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri and Rabbi Akiva about what the brachot of Malchut Zichronot and Shofarot that we say on Musaf of Rosh Hashanah. We say 10 psukim of each, but there's a machloket in the Mishnah. Is it 3 verses or is it 10 verses? And it's not clear in the Mishnah which verses. It's just a matter of how many do you add, and everyone would add their own. In those days, it was more the shliach tzibor, the person who got up to daven. He would prepare his davening before, and preparing wasn't just reading over the siddur. Preparing was choosing what verses I want to say and how I want to do it. That's the way prayer was in those days. It wasn't like it is today. So here you see the same thing. These are your guidelines, okay? That's still not going to be enough for Yaakov bar Ava. So we will see tomorrow how he further questions him on this point. And we learned a lot of interesting things today, both practical about what the order of Kiddush and Havdalah is. And we learned about some interactions between people and how, maybe yes to act as a guest and not to act as a guest. From what we saw here, you can learn how not to ask as a guest, maybe ask your questions a little nicer, maybe you'll get a better answer. And we see even Ravo underwent some sort of change, because in the first two questions, he was kind of annoyed. By the third question, he realized I better give him a good answer and not sort of just shove him off. And, and he was able to learn from what went on to kind of change his approach throughout the story. With that, we will finish for today. Have a great day, everyone.